The 1800s frontier was a harsh place, a land of dust and pride, where grudges were carried like guns and bloodlines meant more than law. Ethan Cole, a weathered rancher with calloused hands and storm-grey eyes, stood outside the chapel, feeling the stares of the town burn into him. Every whisper, every sneer, weighed heavier than the rifle he wore across his back. This was not the marriage of choice, nor of love. It was punishment wrapped as peace, a forced binding meant to settle a feud no bullet had managed to bury. The feud had started months earlier, when a ranch hand accused the neighboring tribe of theft. One accusation became another, until anger spilled into violence. Shots had been fired, lives taken on both sides. The Council of Settlers, desperate to end the bloodshed, sought a solution older than war itself: bind the bloodlines together through marriage. Ethan had been chosen, not because he volunteered, but because he was strong enough to endure the insult and stubborn enough not to run. They told him it was duty. To Ethan, it felt like shackles. When the chapel doors creaked, a hush fell over the restless crowd. The bride appeared, walking with slow, measured steps. Her face was hidden by a thin veil, but the outline of her features was unmistakably proud, regal even. She wore the clothing of her people, not the dresses the settlers wished her to don. The choice alone made the whispers louder, more venomous. "Forbidden!" Someone spat near the door and others chuckled bitterly. Ethan's jaw tightened. He did not look at them. His eyes fixed on her steady gait, the fire in her silence. She reached him at the altar, and for a moment the world stilled. He had expected fear in her eyes, perhaps shame, but when the veil lifted, the sight nearly unmoored him. She was beautiful, not the fragile kind whispered about in saloons, but the strong, unyielding beauty carved by hardship and survival. Her eyes met his without wavering. They said nothing, but they said everything. She had not chosen this any more than he had. In her defiance, Ethan saw a reflection of his own unwillingness, and strangely, it unsettled him. The preacher's voice droned, heavy with words meant to bind. Ethan barely heard them, his chest tight as iron. Each vow, each declaration, felt like a stone being stacked onto his shoulders. When his turn came, he spoke with a voice like gravel, steady yet hollow. When hers came, she answered firmly, her voice clear and strong, silencing even the cruelest whispers in the crowd. At that moment, something shifted. Ethan couldn't explain it, but it was as if the ground beneath him gave way, forcing him to stand on uncertain soil. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted into uneasy murmurs. Some shook their heads, others muttered curses under their breath, but none dared interrupt. Ethan and his new wife stepped out into the sunlight, the air thick with judgment. She walked beside him with her head high, ignoring the townsfolk as though they did not exist. Ethan felt the weight of every eye upon them, but strangely, her defiance steadied him. For the first time, he wondered if perhaps he was not the only prisoner in this arrangement. That night, back at his lonely ranch, the silence between them stretched wider than the plains outside. The walls of his cabin creaked with the wind, and the fire snapped in the hearth, but neither spoke. Ethan poured water into a tin cup and set it before her, watching as she drank with slow dignity. She carried herself like royalty, even in a stranger's home. Ethan studied her in the dim light, not as an intruder, but as an enigma. What kind of woman bore the weight of such humiliation and still sat as though she were the one in control? He thought of her people, of the battles fought in shadows and on ridges. He thought of the blood already spilled. Was she meant to be a peace offering, or was she the spark that might reignite the flames? He could not tell. His thoughts churned like restless horses, and every time he looked at her, he found no answers, only deeper questions. He expected her to despise him, to spit venom or refuse his presence. Instead, she sat quietly by the fire, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. That silence unnerved him more than any outburst could have. Ethan retreated to his small bed, leaving her the cot near the fire. The rancher had faced storms, gunfights, and loneliness that stretched across years, but tonight he felt strangely unprepared. Lying there, staring at the timbered ceiling, he braced himself for anger or tears, perhaps even threats whispered into the night. Instead, he heard nothing but the steady crackle of the fire and the faint rhythm of her breathing. It was a silence that pressed upon him like a weight, and in it he realized the truth. He feared her silence more than her hatred. Sleep came reluctantly, drifting through a haze of thoughts he could not shake. He had entered this marriage expecting chains and resentment. What he had not expected was to feel as though he stood at the edge of a storm, uncertain whether it would bring ruin or rain. Ethan's heart was heavy, but somewhere deep inside, a flicker of something else stirred. Curiosity, respect, perhaps even a hint of admiration. He did not know. All he knew was that the stranger sitting by his fire was no ordinary woman, and her silence was not weakness, but strength wrapped in shadow. As the night deepened, Ethan turned once more, watching her in the glow of the embers. She sat upright still, her posture unbroken as if sleep could not claim her. He wondered if she, too, braced herself for hatred or cruelty, yet found neither. Perhaps she expected him to lash out, to demand obedience like so many others might. But Ethan had no such heart. His life had been carved by loss and labor, and cruelty was not in his nature. So he lay there, saying nothing, carrying the weight of vows forced upon him, waiting for dawn to bring clarity. But clarity did not come with the morning sun. Instead, it came with the realization that their lives, however unwillingly bound, had shifted forever. The frontier was merciless, and unions like theirs were rare, fragile, and dangerous. Yet as Ethan rose, pulling on his boots, he felt something strange in the air, not just the burden of obligation, but the possibility, however slim, that this marriage forced by others might yet become a destiny chosen by them. He did not know it then, but the silence of that first night had already begun to write a story larger than either of them. The fire burned low in the stone hearth, casting amber shadows across the wooden walls of Ethan's cabin. The night was quiet but heavy, as if the land itself held its breath. Ethan sat at the edge of his bed, boots still on, unsure if sleep would ever claim him. His new wife, still more stranger than companion, sat near the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames. When she finally turned to him, the silence cracked. She stepped closer, the faintest tremor in her steps, and whispered words that struck him deeper than any blade. "They call me forbidden, but I am your wife now." Ethan's breath caught. He had braced for resentment, for cold dismissal or bitter accusation. Instead, her voice held neither anger nor submission, but courage wrapped in softness. It disarmed him more than any shout could have. She looked at him not with hatred, but with a strange steadiness, as though testing whether he was man enough to see her as more than the label others spat at her. For the first time, Ethan realized the weight of what she bore, shame not her own. Chains cast upon her by two warring worlds. She lowered her gaze briefly, then raised it again, her words carrying like arrows through the still air. She spoke of honor, of how her people had not sent her as tribute or punishment, but as a bridge. She spoke of blood already spilled, and how her marriage to Ethan might be the last chance to keep both sides from drowning in more of it. Her voice wavered once, but not with fear, with the gravity of truth. Ethan listened, motionless, feeling the very foundation of his anger begin to fracture. The firelight softened her features, revealing not defiance, but strength tempered with grief. She told him of her father, a leader who wanted peace but had been silenced by bullets. She told him of her brother, who still fought in shadows, unwilling to let go of vengeance. And she told him of herself, not as a pawn, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had been forced into a vow she did not choose, yet who chose now to embrace it with dignity. Each word she spoke carried the weight of generations, and Ethan felt humbled. For years, Ethan had thought of the tribes only as enemies, faces in the distance, shadows in the brush, dangers whispered by neighbors. Yet now one of them sat before his fire, closer than any neighbor had ever dared to be. She was no enemy, no ghost. She was flesh and blood, bound to him by law and vow. And as she spoke, he felt a shift within himself, like the earth groaning before the rain. The anger he'd clung to for so long began to dissolve, leaving behind something unexpected: respect. Perhaps even a flicker of hope. The night deepened, and with it, her words carved themselves into him. "They call me forbidden," she whispered again, her eyes glistening in the firelight, "but I am your wife now." The phrase lingered in the air, heavier than any vow spoken at the chapel. She was not demanding his acceptance, nor begging for it. She was offering a choice, to see her as the townsfolk did, as forbidden, or to see her as she was, his partner, his equal, his chance to carve a different story. Ethan's chest tightened with a feeling he could not yet name. He removed his hat, setting it on the table with deliberate care. His hands, rough from years of ranch work, clenched once before relaxing. He looked at her, truly looked, and in her eyes saw not defeat, but a quiet fire. It was the same fire he carried in himself, the fire that refused to bow to chains others had forged. For the first time, Ethan understood. She was not his burden. She was not his punishment. She was his mirror, reflecting back the parts of himself he thought no one else could ever see. The hours bled away as they spoke, hesitant at first, then with growing ease. She told him of her people's ways, the songs sung to the moon, the hunts guided by stars, the laughter of children who had never seen war. He told her of his ranch, of the calves born in spring, of his mother who had taught him kindness before sickness carried her away. Two worlds, once divided by hatred, now stitched together in the fragile threads of conversation. It was not love, not yet, but it was something far rarer, the beginnings of understanding. Outside, the prairie wind howled, a reminder of the harshness that defined their world. Yet inside, the fire held back the cold. Ethan felt it in his bones. Something had changed irreversibly. He no longer saw her as a stranger forced into his life. He saw her as a woman who had chosen courage over despair, dignity over bitterness. In that moment, he envied her strength. He, a rancher who had faced storms and death, found himself humbled by a bride who had lost everything and yet refused to be broken. When silence finally returned, it was no longer heavy. It was a silence born of trust, fragile but real. She turned to the fire once more, her profile softened by the glow, and Ethan lay back, his mind restless yet strangely calm. For the first time in months, he did not dream of feuds or blood. He dreamt of fields untouched by war, of voices raised not in anger but in song. Somewhere deep inside, he knew she had planted that vision. It terrified him as much as it comforted him. Change always did. The dawn came slow, painting the plains with strokes of gold and crimson. Ethan rose early, as always, pulling on his boots and stepping outside to tend the livestock. Yet as he looked back at the cabin, smoke curling from the chimney, he felt something new. An anchor. She was inside waiting, not as a prisoner but as a partner. The vow he had once cursed now felt less like a chain and more like a promise, fragile but worth keeping. And though the town still whispered forbidden, Ethan no longer cared. For the first time, he believed in tomorrow. That evening, when he returned from the fields, she was outside, gathering kindling with practiced hands. Their eyes met and something unspoken passed between them. A truce, a recognition, perhaps even the faintest trace of a bond forming where none should exist. Ethan tipped his hat, a gesture small yet profound, and she answered with the faintest smile, barely there, but enough to pierce the armor he had worn for years. In that moment, Ethan knew the truth. The vow forced upon him might just be the only one strong enough to save not only them, but both their worlds.